Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Timur Podcast, a show that investigates the life, conquests, character, and legacy of the infamous 14th century warlord Emir Timur, or simply Timur. Welcome, I am glad you're here. Today's episode is going to be or not to be, it is to be different from the rest. I'm going to cut that. It is going to be different than all of our other episodes. We are going to jump out of the narrative for a bit and talk about one of the most famous things about Timur. It could actually be the most famous thing about him, and that is, of course, his lameness. And so I made this short episode it's solely about this topic so that it's easy for people to find if they just want to jump right into this. Anyway, if you read, watch, or listen to literally anything about Timur, inevitably at some point, probably sooner than later, they'll tell you that he was lame. And it is this fact that has been cemented into the history of this man and how he will forever be remembered. Not that he conquered a gigantic empire, not that he began one of the most important dynasties of all time, not that Central Asia experienced a renaissance because of him. No, it's because he walked funny. That's how we've decided to remember him. And indeed, in much of the world, but especially in the West, Timur is often remembered with the title Timur the Lame. And eventually this title turned into the bastardization title of Tamerlane. And for the most part, Timur is referred to as Tamerlane in Europe and the United States. Now, I should point out, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the far future when we talk about Timur's legacy, but in certain parts of Central Asia, especially in Uzbekistan, Timur is remembered very differently than how the rest of the world remembers him. There are many people here, certainly not all, but many, who remember Timur as a hero, an icon to uphold even to this day. And this is very complicated and certainly controversial, and I just don't want to dive into this now, but here's what I'm getting at. Sometimes people might get offended if you refer to Timur as Timur the Lame, because it may be diminishing his perceived greatness by making fun of his disability. In fact, I was just reading a recent news article in which a religious figure in Afghanistan referred to Timur as Timur the Lame, and there was quite a backlash in Uzbekistan because of this. People were not too pleased and demanded that he apologize. So this is something you should just kind of keep in mind if you're going to go around shouting that Timur was lame. I don't know what else you would shout about, but this is one of those great examples of how Timur's legacy is alive to this day. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, or that we should or should not call Timur the Lame. All I'm trying to do is to let you know that the title or a name Timur the Lame it's a bit of a hot topic today depending on where you are in the world. Anyway, with that cleared up a bit, let's talk about Timur. As I'm sure you've come to expect by now, there are several differing accounts, of course, as to just how Timur achieved his lameness. I'm going to read to you 4 of the most popular accounts, and these do somewhat agree, but there are some minor discrepancies you'll notice. And one more thing, if you want the broader picture of where Timur's injuries fit into the narrative of his life, I recommend you listen to the previous 2 episodes, part 1 and part 2 of the Desert Years. Anyway, here are what the different accounts say. Ahmad ibn Arab Shah, a very anti-Timur source, writes this: "But because of poverty, Timur began to commit acts of thievery, and in the course of these exploits was wounded and mutilated. For when he wanted to carry off a sheep which he had stolen one night, the shepherd cleft his shoulder with an arrow and maimed it, and shooting a second arrow at the hip, damaged the hip. So mutilation was added to his poverty, and a blemish to his wickedness and fury, with which he went about with his hand against every man." You can definitely hear the hate that Arab Shah has for Timur in this description. And believe me, Arab Shah has every reason to harbor this hate, and we'll talk about that at a later time. But for now, let's go to our next source, the Zafarnama, which means the Book of Victories. The Book of Victories is a biography of Timur written by a man named Sharif al-Din Ali Yazdi, and the Zafarnama tells us that Timur was engaged with enemies while in the region of Sistan, and during one of his several battles in this region, this happens. The slaughter which he soon made, that is Timur we're talking about, obliged the enemies to employ all of their strength against him alone. They oppressed him with their arrows, and though he always made a vigorous defense, he was dangerously wounded in the hand. So this sounds a bit different than Arab Shah's account. There's no sheep stealing here, but just a good old honest battle. The Zafarnama, though, is a very pro-Timur source, so maybe the author chose to leave out the criminal activity in order to portray Timur as a more honest man. Next up, let's look at Timur's own memoirs. Now, his memoirs are a source that may or may not be legitimate. There are some who vehemently defend it as original, but recent scholarship is increasingly rejecting it as not actually a part of Timur's autobiography. But I've included it here because it basically mirrors what the Zafarnama said, and it's written quite well. The memoirs of Timur say this: "The archers poured in their arrows, and the cavalry, having made a furious charge, threw the enemy into confusion. I then, accompanied by 12 troopers, dashed in among them. At this time I was wounded by 2 arrows, one in the arm and the other in the foot. But I was so enraged that I did not feel them at the time, but continued to fight till the enemy fled." So, same situation here, no mention of any sheep, just a battle, and since of course this is the supposed autobiography of Timur, he is portrayed as an absolute legend of a man. Finally, let's look at the account of Roy Gonzalez de Clavijo. If you listened to one of our episodes, I think 2 or 3 releases ago, then you heard David from the History of Spain podcast mention this man. Roy Gonzalez de Clavijo was a diplomat sent from the Kingdom of Castile, which is in present-day Spain, sent all the way to Timur in order to find out what was happening on this far side of the world and possibly seek out an alliance against the Ottoman Turks. And during this journey, Clavijo kept a very detailed log of his whole trip, which is great for us because it gives us this excellent history of Timur. And this is what Clavijo, who is neither super anti-Timur nor very pro-Timur, this is what he says about Timur's injuries. "They, the people of Sistan, assembled together, and one night when he had fallen upon a great flock of sheep, they attacked him, killed many of his men, knocked him off his horse, and wounded him in the right leg, which lamed him. They also wounded him in the right hand, and cut off 2 of his fingers, leaving him for dead. As soon as he was able, he got up and went to the tents of some people who were encamped on the plain, where he returned to collect his followers again." And this is the account that I find most compelling. One, because Clavijo doesn't really have much to gain either by portraying Timur as a hero or as a servant of the devil. No, Clavijo is just a messenger and traveler from Spain, and he has less skin in the game because, well, he's not from here. He hasn't suffered from the campaigns of Timur either by serving with Timur or being attacked by Timur. Thus, his account is often considered one of the most accurate sources we have on Timur. But number 2, we also see here that there are elements of both the sheep stealing and some sort of battle. Thus, what I see as likely is that while Timur was serving as a mercenary in Sistan, he had men following him, and these men needed to eat. So either on their way from one place to another, or maybe after being refused to pay by one of their clients, they went to pillage some sheep for food. Then things went wrong, the people of the nearby city attacked them, and in the chaos, Timur was defeated, wounded, and probably left for dead. But the pillaging sheep aspect makes more sense to me because, well, armies pillage whatever land they're on, typically. That's how they sustain themselves, especially in territory that doesn't belong to them. And if Timur is acting as a mercenary here, or maybe as an outright outlaw, then yeah, he's probably pillaging the land. But those are the main accounts that we have, and you can kind of go with whatever version you want, although most historians agreed that this was the period in Timur's life, sometime between the year 1363 and 1365, while in the region of Sistan probably working as a mercenary or bandit, that he received these wounds. Oh, and a quick distinction here. I say working as a mercenary or bandit, but in the medieval world there was rarely a distinction between these two. If you were hired, you were a mercenary since you had a stable income coming in, but in between campaigns or when you weren't in a contract, you'd likely resort to extorting the population and stealing whatever you needed. This is just yet another wonderful thing about medieval history, and there are countless accounts all across medieval history of people trying to figure out what do we do with these roving bands of mercenaries who are out of work and now they're just going around killing and stealing from people. Okay, but back to Timur. I know that I've shared with you so many stories and whatnot that I later unhelpfully clarify are possibly true, or possibly myth, or maybe both, or we don't know. Well, I've got good news for you. Timur was actually lame. We have actually had this confirmed. I mean, the fact that our pro-Timur sources confirm the injuries are quite telling in of themselves, but now let's get into some actual science. Timur is often compared to Genghis Khan, and there are many good reasons for this. The two men had many similarities, and we'll look into this more once Timur begins his campaigns, but one interesting difference between the two is that Genghis Khan's burial site is completely unknown. As the story goes, and it could indeed be a true story, when Genghis Khan's body was brought back to Mongolia and prepared for burial, it was then taken out to a secret location and buried. Then when the men who buried him returned, they were all killed to ensure that his resting place remained a secret. But wherever his body rests, there is no doubt that a good amount of treasure is buried with him, as well as the possible remains of the greatest conqueror of all time. And so, as you can imagine, ever since, adventurers, archaeologists, historians, all sorts of people from all walks of life have searched for the burial location of the Great Khan. In fact, that's kind of one of my backup plans, in case I'm ever out of work, is to go look for Genghis Khan's burial site. But unfortunately, all these attempts so far have not yielded success. National Geographic even used satellite imagery to try and find buried burial grounds. That's redundant, but whatever. Buried burial grounds in order to find the one where the Great Khan was located. And they didn't find it. But, in contrast, we do know where Timur is buried. His body currently rests in the Gur Amir, which in Persian means the tomb of the king. And this mausoleum is in Samarkand, Uzbekistan today, and I haven't been there, but the pictures are absolutely beautiful. The building it's in just perfectly exemplifies the Timurid style of art, and we'll talk about that style of art later, but just look for pictures of Timur's burial site. It's a really neat building. As for this building, the mausoleum was built beginning in 1403, when Timur was still alive, and it was intended to be the resting place for Muhammad Sultan Mirza, Timur's grandson and heir, but he died before Timur himself died, so Timur built this burial ground for him. And Muhammad Sultan Mirza is buried here, along with several of Timur's sons and other grandsons, and of course, Timur. And you can visit this place today. Timur's remains have been here for the most part ever since his death in 1405, but there have been attempts to move his body elsewhere. King Nadir Shah, an 18th century Persian king, idolized Timur and wanted to move Timur's remains closer to the heartland of his Persian Empire. However, in the 1740s when this was attempted, as Timur's sarcophagus was being hooked up to be removed, it cracked into two pieces. And this was widely seen as a terrible omen, and Nadir Shah quickly ordered for it to be returned and presumably restored, as the sarcophagus is in one piece today. And so Timur's body rested. But let's fast forward a few centuries to the year 1941. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union and a fond admirer of history, orders that an archaeological dig be sent to Samarkand to examine the remains of Timur. By the 1940s, Uzbekistan was, and had been for some time, firmly dominated by Russian influence, and then, of course, Soviet influence. Russia and Great Britain had played what is called the Great Game in the 1800s for who could influence/control Central Asia the most. It was very much like the Cold War in a lot of ways, but the end result was that Russia got the upper hand in at least kind of the northern half of Central Asia. And then eventually, years later, the Bolshevik Revolution occurs, and the area of modern-day Uzbekistan, along with much of Central Asia, was incorporated into the Soviet Union. And the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic was created on October 27, 1924, and it lasted pretty much until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, although the Uzbeks had declared state sovereignty in June of 1990, so you'll see a few different dates here. All this to say, Uzbekistan was firmly under the control of the Soviet Union at the time of Joseph Stalin's regime and during World War II. In fact, about 1.5 million people from Uzbekistan fought in the Red Army. But anyway, because Stalin controlled the land of the resting place of Timur, nobody was stopping him from sending out this archaeological expedition, and so Stalin ordered that it be done. Leading this expedition was Soviet archaeologist, and I'm gonna try here, Mikhail Gerasimov. And forgive me if I'm saying that wrong, I can never do Russian names, but okay. Mikhail was actually quite an interesting guy. From a young age, he was enthralled by skeletal remains. So that weird kid you didn't want to play with, that was Mikhail. He was often found examining the bones of animals that were dug up by construction teams in his hometown. But later on in life, he was educated in anthropology, history, archaeology, and things like this, and quickly became an expert in such areas. He even later discovered an entire long-lost society known today as the Malta Beret, which was an ancient Siberian group of people who lived like 20,000 years ago or so. So that's pretty neat. It's not everyone who has on their resume discovered lost civilization. But probably Mikhail's most important accomplishment is he is pretty much the father or one of the fathers of forensic facial reconstruction. That is, by looking at the remains of a human skull and by understanding the connection between human tissue and bone, he could accurately reconstruct what that human face would likely have looked similar to so many years before. So if you've ever been to a museum or seen a movie or read a book where you see this facial reconstruction of ancient figures, maybe Egyptian pharaohs or such, how they might have looked, well, this is forensic facial reconstruction, and you have Mikhail to thank for this. And indeed, Mikhail himself reconstructed the faces of many historical figures, including people like Yaroslav the Wise and even Ivan the Terrible. He later wrote an autobiography, a book called The Face Finder, which I really want to read. It sounds excellent, but in it he says that one of his greatest joys was solving this mystery, and to, quote, gaze on the faces of those long dead, which is kind of morbid, but also pretty interesting and a wonderful way to make history come alive. Anyway, so Mikhail was chosen to lead this expedition to examine Timur's remains, and he was certainly qualified for the job. And so on June 22nd, 1941, the Soviet team removed Timur's sarcophagus, opened it up, and examined the body of one of the most fearsome conquerors of all time. And this is what Mikhail and his team confirmed about Timur. First of all, Timur would have been considered very tall for the era. He measured to about 173 centimeters tall, and the average for that time would have fallen somewhere between 160 to 168 centimeters. And for my fellow Americans, this means that Timur was about 5 feet 8 inches, and the average height for a man in this time period was about 5'4" or 5'5". So he was tall, very tall, towering over probably most of the people around him. And on top of this, they found that he had wide shoulders and a broad chest. So Timur must have been this towering and imposing figure, and knowing these exact measurements just brings him to life. And they also found that Timur had had a long beard and that it had most likely been a reddish color. This would have made him stand out even more. But as for Timur's injuries, Mikhail did confirm that Timur was injured just as our sources said. His right arm was crippled and had never healed completely from the arrow. It was withered, 2 of the fingers were gone, and it indicated that Timur probably had it curled and adjacent to his torso most of the time. His right leg was partially destroyed. His right thigh bone had knitted together with the kneecap, making his entire right leg a bit shorter than his left leg, and also indicating that Timur kept this leg slightly bent at all times, meaning that whenever he walked, he would have hobbled. So what this Soviet team found out is invaluable to us as we study Timur. Timur's body was soon after this removed and actually taken to Moscow, where it was studied further. And perhaps most valuable of all, Mikhail completed one of those forensic facial reconstructions of Timur's face. Meaning, although this certainly is not 100% accurate, the bust that Mikhail made is probably pretty close and certainly the closest representation we'll ever have to what Timur looked like. And all I have to say about Timur's face is, it's the face of a conqueror. I'll post this picture on Twitter, Facebook, and the podcast website. Or if you want, just look up Timur's Wikipedia page, and the statue on the upper right-hand side before you scroll down is Mikhail's reconstruction. And it's just wild that we have this. But speaking of, the Soviet dig left us other things as well. Probably. Now, there's a chance this isn't the case, as it's very hard to verify, but I am fairly certain that there are a couple grainy pictures of Mikhail and his group uncovering Timur's body and examining the different parts of it. And probably the picture you can find the most is the group examining and smiling as Mikhail is holding Timur's skull. It's crazy, I'll post this picture. And finally, craziest of all, it was filmed. Or parts of it was. And I found what I am 95% certain is the actual film from the dig. It's hard to verify this as the video was obscenely hard to track down, surprisingly, and most of the leads were in languages I can't read, but I'm pretty sure this is it, and I'll post the link as well because it really is worth watching. But of course, a warning, it is graphic and it may be disturbing to some. This is the mummified corpse of Timur, after all. But it's just hard to explain how crazy it is to watch footage of these guys passing around Timur's femur and his skull and laughing and smoking and grinning in this moment. It's absolutely wild. Okay, it is time to talk about Timur's curse. Because if there's one thing talked more about in regards to Timur than his actual lameness, it's the curse. The curse of Tamerlane's tomb. And my neighbors are dancing in celebration. Anyway, so yeah, Timur's tomb is apparently cursed. And you cannot read 3 sentences about Timur online without somebody commenting about the curse of Timur's tomb. So why don't we talk about this now? You'll find a few slightly different versions of the curse and the accompanying conspiracy, but here's the basic gist of it. Let's go back to June 22nd, 1941. Mikhail and his team of archaeologists have arrived at Timur's tomb with the intention to investigate his remains, just as we talked about earlier. But here's where the curse and conspiracy come into play. According to the stories, 3 Uzbek men barred the way against the team, pleading with them to the point of tears not to do what they were about to do, and mumbling about Timur's wrath and other foreboding things. But the team politely pushed past the men with no intentions to stop. After all, they're doing this under the orders of Joseph Stalin, and you probably don't want to go against those orders. Once inside the mausoleum and at the sarcophagus of Timur, they found an inscription that read one of 2 things, or possibly both. And these are, "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." And the other line is, "Whoever disturbs my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than I." But nevertheless, the team went ahead unfazed, and Timur's remains were dug up just like we talked about. But of course, the date was June 22nd, 1941, when all of this occurred. And this is the exact same day that Nazi Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, surprising the Soviet Union and launching the largest invasion in human history into Russia. So as the conspiracy goes, this was Timur's curse. The same exact day that he is unearthed, Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union, the same Soviet Union that had sent this team to dig Timur up. And like the warning of the inscription said, the Nazis certainly were a much more terrible invader than Timur ever was. Now, it does look like at least part of this is verifiable. Operation Barbarossa did launch on June 22nd, 1941, and I read in several sources that I trust that this was the same day that Mikhail's team unearthed Timur. As for the inscriptions in Timur's tombs, though, I haven't found anything either confirming or denying their existence. But the tomb is still around, obviously. I feel like it would be pretty easy for somebody to go there, have a look around, and confirm to us whether or not they find anything. But maybe the Soviets took the inscriptions with them in this kind of cover-up thing. I don't know. But here's the thing. The story goes on. So after Timur's remains are brought out, they are shipped back to Moscow for further study, and this is, as we discussed, when Mikhail made the facial reconstruction of Timur's skull. Well, Timurid history aside for the moment, the year is still 1941, and this little old thing called the Second World War is really not going well for the Russians. The Soviet Union is just being trounced. Within 4 months, the Germans are laying siege to the capital of Moscow, and Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, is panicking. So as our story continues, in 1942, word starts to reach Stalin about how his country has been stricken by the curse of Timur's tomb. And after hearing this, Stalin commands that Timur's remains be flown back to Samarkand as quickly as possible and reburied. So Timur is loaded onto a plane and flown out of Moscow. But on the flight south, due to terrible winter weather, the plane either was blown off course or had to make a detour, and ended up flying directly over this Russian city called Stalingrad on the Volga River. But moving on, eventually the plane made it back to Uzbekistan, and Timur was given a formal and official reburial with strict adherence to Islamic tradition. And a few weeks later, at that city of Stalingrad where the plane had flown over, the Russians were victorious, capturing the entire German 6th Army, and not only turning the tide on the Eastern Front, but turning the tide of the entire war. And as the story of the curse concludes, the victory of Stalingrad came because Timur's body was correctly laid to rest again. And that is the story of the curse of Timur's tomb. Now, it does appear that Timur's body was returned in 1942 and buried according to Islamic ceremony, but anything other than this I was unable to confirm or deny. Granted, I didn't really look into the story more than what I just told you, but it is a fascinating and fun story, and people believe it. A lot of people believe it. In fact, you can still find people who blame Mikhail and his team for bringing on the invasion of Nazi Germany because of what they did to Timur's tomb. And it is quite fun to think about. I think evil curses involving the Nazis, communists, and medieval warlords are literally the #1 favorite topic of discussion of, pretty much everybody. So maybe in the far future I'll return to this subject and make an episode on Timur's curse in which we dive into it a whole lot more. That could be fun, and who knows, maybe there's more that I'm missing or things that I got wrong. Again, I didn't look into this too much other than what I told you. Or maybe we can bully the podcast Our Fake History to do an episode on this, although there's probably just not enough material to work with. But actually, here's a side note. If you have not listened to the podcast Our Fake History, I encourage you to do so. It's one of my favorites, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Sebastian investigates historical myths and legends to find out what's true and what's myth, and it's fun, it's exciting, and he does a great job, so go check it out. But with that, I think we'll draw this episode to a close. Next time, we'll join the narrative of Timur again as he and his brother-in-law, Amir Hussein, attempt to liberate Mawarnar from the Mughals. If you've enjoyed the show, consider leaving a rating or a review on whichever listening platform you use. It helps the show out, and it makes my day whenever I see them, so consider it. If you want to reach out to me for any time or for any reason, feel free to email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com or follow the show on Facebook at timurpod or on Twitter at podcasttimur. Or find out more about the show's website, find out more on the show's website at timurpodcast.com. I need to stop recording and go make dinner. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I appreciate it. I'm so glad you're on this journey with me. I will see you next episode right here on the Timur Podcast.